We have come across in news from time to time that there are lots of great innovations that help us reduce pollution, that help us clean up the environment. We know that, for example, there are now cars that don't run on diesel, they run on electricity, they even run on hydrogen fuels. They are great things. We also know that we have LED light bulbs that can save energy. But I always have the question, why don't people use them? That's why they are so good. It seems that solving environmental problems requires something more than science. Well, science is very important because they help us create all these kinds of gadgets, all these kinds of new devices and technologies that would enable us to really achieve a more low impact lifestyle. But if we want to implement them, if we want to use them, that question has gone beyond what scientists would look for. That actually steps into the field of politics. We are not short of engineering solutions. What we are short of is the commitment to solve environmental problems, because we cannot agree on the nature of environmental problems, because we cannot agree on which environmental problem should be solved first, because we cannot agree on who should shoulder the responsibility and pay for the cost. And we cannot also agree on what are the actions that we really have to take if we want to solve those problems. Without a consensus on how we should move forward, those solutions would only be sitting there waiting for people to pick up. With all these problems, political issues surrounding us, it doesn't mean that we cannot move forward our environmental agenda. It rather means that we need to have a better understanding about why people disagree with each other, why people cannot come up with a common definition and common agenda about environmental issues that they want to solve. And that is why environmental politics as a discipline is important, because we try to relate environmental problems to existing political structures, to existing political institutions, to existing ways that people debate and think about environmental issues. Environmental problems are, after all, problems related to the mankind. We humans are the troublemakers, and if we cannot come up with a consensus among ourselves, it's very difficult for the environment to be improved, even if we have all these kinds of brilliant technical solutions available. Environmental issues have always been closely related to the development of our global political economic systems. Over the years, we have seen a lot of conflicts between countries that are related to the use of natural resources. One good example will be what happened in Africa back in the 19th and early 20th century, the period that we now call the Scramble of Africa. Back in those days, quite a few Western European countries were quickly industrializing, and they were running out of cheap supply of natural resources like minerals and timber that would support the economy to grow further. And in order to keep up with that growing tendency in the economy, they start look for alternatives beyond their territories. And what they have done is a kind of exploitative colonialism, where they went to Africa, they tried to colonize places there and to gain access to their plentiful natural resources, so that they can ensure that they have enough raw material supplies for their industry back at home. And what they did is to colonize those places, exploit native people to open up all these resources for them to be exported back to the home countries. And that is a very good example how natural resource environmental elements are related to politics. And that kind of issues of resource security, about how we can ensure that we have enough resource to support our lives and economy continues today. A closer example to Hong Kong would be the conflicts over water resource supplies in Singapore and Malaysia. We know that Singapore has for many years relied on importing water from across the border from Johor in Malaysia. And last year, Malaysian Prime Minister said that they would like to revise their water export agreement with Singapore because they think that they are now selling water to Singapore very cheaply. And under that kind of political pressure, which has not only emerged recently, but has always been featured in Singapore's history as an island state with little freshwater resource, Singapore government has always been bold in trying to open up alternative sources of water. For example, new water. They try to recycle water that they have already used, and they try to purify them so that they can use it, if not for drinking, for other purposes like industrial uses. The control over water resource has a lot of political implications. It would create conflicts between countries. It would also create conflicts within each country, between its people and the government, over how they can improve and ensure they controlled over very essential resources for their lives. Climate change is a topic that we frequently discuss in MGPE classes because it's a proper global problem. None of us, no political or economic sector, is going to be left unaffected by the impacts of climate change. And I think there are two perspectives that are particularly useful for us to understand the current political complexity surrounding decision-making on our climate change responses. The first one is politics of scale. Decision-making is not made at any one particular scale. It's made at multiple scales. When you hear the terms global political economy, you might think that our program would only ask you to consider things like international conferences in which national governments participate to deliberate on whether they want to have a common agenda to deal with climate change, whether they would agree on certain kinds of compulsory targets for carbon emission reductions. That's not what we try to do. Rather, we want to tell you that to solve these global problems, we need efforts from many parties, not just global organizations, not just national governments. Indeed, when national representatives left the debate tables in these climate change conferences, that is not where the politics of climate change ends. That's actually the beginning of more politics. They have to bring the target back to their home country, and they have to think about ways that they can ensure that these targets can be achieved. In that case, they will have to involve in very intensive bargaining with their local governments. They would need the support of their local governments to implement measures that are suitable to individuals, local territories, that will help us achieve part of the emission reduction targets. And there's quite a lot of political confrontations there because local governments may debate about the share of responsibilities within the country, just like the national governments are debating about who or which country should actually shoulder more responsibility on an international scale about reducing carbon emissions. Because we all know if there is a need for us to reduce carbon emissions, we sometimes need to make changes, and changes can come quite costly at times in terms of, for example, a slowdown in economic growth. And at the same time, we also see that national government is no longer the only scale that helps to move climate change forward. Some cities are actually joining hands across national boundaries to engage in exchange of ideas and policies to help each other achieve a better future, especially when the national governments are not so supportive in making changes for climate change adaptations. So we see the creations of C40 in about 15 years ago, and now that is an organization joined by over 90 cities. Another useful perspective that I want to talk about is the politics of representations. If we want to solve an environmental problems, it's best that we have a very concrete representation of the problem, which means that we can measure the problems. We know how serious it is, so that if we are devising certain kinds of solutions to it, we can know that how each solution is going to contribute to a particular level of reductions or alleviation of that problem. Unfortunately, that is not the case for carbon emissions. There are numerous sources of carbon emissions, and they entail different kinds of greenhouse gas. It's a very, very difficult task for us to conduct carbon accounting to take all these things into account. After all these years that we talk about the importance of giving each of us a number about our carbon footprint, we still struggle to have a universally agreed standard to do carbon accounting. Well, there are standards that are adopted here and there, but they are not applied across the world, agreed by everyone. That has to do with the fact that countries and people do not like to be labeled as emitting a lot of carbon, a lot of greenhouse gas. And they will try to argue about what constitutes carbon emission of a particular territory. They may debate about whether emissions from abroad due to goods that you import into a country should be taken into account. They may also debate about how we can attribute carbon emissions related to air travel to particular places. It is often the debates and disagreement about what should be taken into account into the calculation of carbon footprint in a particular place that prevents us from having more meaningful discussion about how we can solve the problems. Without understanding how serious the problem we are facing is, without understanding how much damage that we're doing to the environment, we won't be motivated to make changes. We won't be motivated to take serious efforts to reduce our carbon footprint. In recent years, green growth has become a catchword in our debates about global political economy. There are so many institutions, countries that gives priority to the idea of green growth. The United Nations talk about it, the World Bank talk about it, the IMF talk about it, China talk about it, the United States, when it was still ruled by Barack Obama, talk about it. So green growth is everywhere, but perhaps we need to understand that green growth, this very term, means many different things in different political and economic contexts, and it brings different impacts to the environment. The first understanding of green growth is that growth, the very idea of growth, is being modified by environmental objectives, by interests in reducing environmental pollutions, in improving environmental quality. So there are quite a few different approaches to green growth. For some countries, what they do is, we are now calling it green Keynesianism. The national governments try to invest a lot of money into infrastructure related to environmental improvement, for example, green transport. They hoped to find a kind of win-win solutions in which they can stimulate the economy, especially after the 2008 financial crisis. These infrastructure spending can hopefully boost the economy while at the same time achieve some kinds of environmental benefits. Like in the case of green transport, that would certainly help reduce emissions related to road traffic. In some other countries, the preferred approach to green growth would be to reduce subsidies on polluting industries, and that kind of reduction would provide incentives for cleaner production, for industries to improve the existing production mechanisms so that they would have less environmental externalities imposed on their country and perhaps in other parts of the world if these industries are in the form of global enterprises. And still some other countries emphasize that they need to develop a green industry. They want to be leaders in green technologies. They want to be leaders, for example, in the production of hybrid cars and cars that run on cleaner fuels, because they believe that the future is a future that emphasizes a lot on greener, cleaner lifestyles. And being a leader in these kinds of technologies and related products would give them a very strong competitive edge in the years to come in the competitions for economic growth across the world. But at the same time, we should also see that in the paradigm of green growth, not only growth is motivated by green ideas, but the very idea of environmental protection is also motivated by an imperative to achieve growth at the same time. For example, we now see more instances of quantifying ecological services. We now want to give a price tag to our environment, to cut it into different elements and assign them with a particular value. That is the case when we are talking about buying credits for carbon reductions. If you emit too much, you pay money to another country claiming that, okay, you plant that many trees for me, you retain the forest for me as carbon sink, and I can emit more in the country. So those trees, even without cutting them off, enable a country to earn more money because they are treated as carbon sinks. Their ecological service is now valued. For many people, that is a good thing because it seems that finally we are paying attention to the importance of all these kinds of environmental elements to our lives. We are willing to pay for their conservations. But there is a risk that if our focus is always on these kinds of win-win environmental measures, we only protect the environment when it is valuable to be protected, when we can earn money on that. If there is a collapse in the carbon credits market, when it is no longer that profitable to protect that piece of forest, would that shift a government's attention to the other areas? Would they pay less attention to the importance of protecting the environment? Would they lose sight of the fact that protection of environment should not be about making profits, but it's about saving the lives of its future generations? That is something that requires us to think more deeply about.